On the night of the 16th of August 1890, a man scaled the granite wall of Dartmoor prison, dropped down into the yard with a knife in his pocket and a box of matches, and went looking for someone to kill. Every man inside that prison was trying to get out, but Joseph Denny was trying to get inside. So today, we're going to look into his life and try to work out what, exactly, drove him to climb into one of the worst prisons in England, off his own free will. To understand Joseph, you have to understand what he was climbing into. Dartmoor had been built in 1809, designed by an architect called Daniel Asher Alexander, on commission from the Duchy of Cornwall, to hold French prisoners taken in the Napoleonic Wars. Then, from 1813, it took American sailors taken in the War of 1812. Sailors pressed off merchant ships and held at Dartmoor against their will. Many of them were still inside it in April 1815, when British guards opened fire on a crowd of them, in what the Americans have remembered ever since as the Dartmoor Massacre. After that, the prison sat empty for 35 years, a granite castle of a building going slowly to ruin 1,000 feet up on an exposed Devon moor. Until in 1850, the British government, having more or less run out of places to send its convicts, now that Australia was politely asking it to stop, reopened it for civilian use. By the time Joseph arrived in the 1870s, Dartmoor had become the second stage of the British penal servitude system, which in practical terms meant habitual offenders, men with long sentences, and the ones the system had given up on. The work was breaking granite. The food was deliberately monotonous, because the authorities did not want prison rations to be more attractive than what an honest labourer could afford on the outside. The weather on 1,000 feet of exposed Devon moor did the rest. Even by the standards of Victorian punishment, Dartmoor was the place you sent men when you wanted them to be broken. Joseph Denny was born in Barbados sometime around 1846 and went to sea as a cabin boy at 12, which was not unusual for a child of his background in the British Caribbean in the 1850s. The merchant fleet was always hungry for crew, and a working ship was, in many ways, considerably more democratic than working life on shore. By his early 20s he was in England, and by his early 20s he was also stealing. In early 1872 he stood in front of the bench at London Petty Sessions on a charge of stealing a coat under the name Henry Dennis, and got 3 calendar months. Then in the September of the same year he was at Middlesex Sessions on another coat stealing charge, this time as Robert Benjamin, and got 12 months. So already, before any of the serious sentences, he is doing the thing he is going to keep on doing for the next 23 years, giving the courts a different name every single time he comes through. In December 1873, he is at Liverpool Assizes, calling himself Joseph Hedderley Denny this time, and pleading guilty to 2 burglaries committed on the same night the previous September. The earlier Middlesex conviction came out in court, which is how we know about Robert Benjamin in the first place, and that previous conviction mattered for a specific reason. The Habitual Criminals Act had come in 2 years earlier. It had created a national register of repeat offenders kept at Scotland Yard, and it meant that for a man with a previous felony, the next sentence was going to be considerably heavier than it would have been a decade before. Joseph was given 7 years penal servitude. Now, penal servitude in the 1870s was a 3-stage process. The first stage was 9 months of separate confinement at Pentonville, 23 hours a day in a cell, picking oakum, which is the work of unpicking old rope into its constituent fibres, so that those fibres could be reused for caulking ships. The point was that you would emerge from those 9 months, supposedly, chastened and ready to be useful. After that, you went to do public works at one of the convict establishments. For Joseph, that meant Dartmoor, for the first time, in 1874. We don't have his prison file from that first stretch. Much of the Dartmoor archive went up in smoke in the 1932 mutiny, when rioting convicts set fire to the administration block and irreplaceable records were lost. But what we do know about his time on the moor in the 1870s comes from what was read out in court at his next trial 8 years later. And from the regime that prevailed at Dartmoor in those years, under the chairman of the Board of Directors of Convict Prisons, Sir Edmund de Caen, whose philosophy was deterrence over reformation, and whose preferred tool was the silence rule. Convicts at Dartmoor were forbidden from speaking to one another while at work, in chapel, on the march to the quarries, in the cells. The reasoning was that prisoners speaking to each other corrupted each other. The punishment for breaking the silence rule was the dark cell, a restricted diet, or in serious cases, the lash. We know from later proceedings that Joseph served the entire 7 years without a single day of remission for good behaviour, which in the language of the convict service of the 1870s meant his conduct had been so bad that the authorities had cancelled the standard ticket of leave entitlement that came at the end of a long sentence. We know he had been ordered to be flogged at one point during those years, but the prison surgeon had stepped in and stopped it on health grounds. We know he had spent 720 days across his sentence in cumulative spells on a punishment diet of bread and water. 2 years of his life on bread and water. He came out at the end of that sentence in late 1880 and was almost immediately back inside. On the 12th of January 1881, at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, he pleaded guilty to a burglary in which he had stolen £25 in cash and some clothing from a house. By this point, his file at Scotland Yard ran to 27 sheets, and the press were running stories on his extraordinary career of crime. He was sentenced to another 8 years penal servitude. And then, standing in the dock at the Old Bailey, having just been handed his second long sentence, Joseph said something to the court that the Morning Post printed in full on the 5th of February 1881. "Why don't you send me to the gallows right away?" he said. "I shall be sure to do something. I shall commit murder before I am done." He was telling the court, on the way back to Pentonville and then back to Dartmoor for another 8 years, that when he got out, he was going to kill someone. The court, by all available evidence, did not take this seriously. 3 months later, on the 7th of April 1881, a photograph was taken of him at Pentonville Prison. It survives in 2 albums of pictures of prisoners taken in March and April of that year, which was studied much later by the historian Caroline Bressie for her work on the black presence in Victorian Britain. The photograph from that album is on your screen now. So back he went for what would prove to be the longer of his 2 stretches on the moor. These 8 years, 1881 to 1889, are the years that produced the man who climbed the wall in 1890. We don't have the daily detail. What we have is what Joseph said about them in court, what the press reported, and 1 or 2 later remarks from the man he came back to murder, Augustus Hardy, the chief warder at Dartmoor, which, by the way, is a serious rank in the convict service of the day, the senior uniformed officer below the governor, effectively the man running the daily discipline of the prison floor. Beyond that role, the documentary record on Augustus is extraordinarily thin. What we have of him is what Joseph said about him, and what he said about himself in one courtroom appearance in November 1890. The convicts at Dartmoor knew him as Flash Hardy, though we don't know exactly why. Joseph's grievances, when he eventually laid them out in court, were specific. He claimed he had been treated worse than a dog, that he had been put in irons and confined in the dark cell, and that he had been singled out because he was a black man and a plain speaker. He claimed Augustus had effectively run Dartmoor on his own, governor, deputy governor, doctor and clergyman in one, without anyone above him paying enough attention to check what he was doing. A black man inside a Victorian convict prison in the 1880s would have had very few protections from exactly the kind of treatment he was describing. And the formal complaints process at Dartmoor was, by every account from the period, almost entirely toothless. A convict who got a reputation for reporting warders found his sentence got harder, not the warder's career. When he came out in January 1889, he did the same thing he had done at 12. He went to sea. The contemporary accounts say 9 months. We don't know which ship or where it took him, but a man who had just done 9 months at sea at 43, after 8 years inside, had clearly not lost the ability to work a ship. We know he was back in England by the summer of 1890, and we know he had not used those months at sea to let go of anything. The night of Saturday the 16th of August 1890 was Joseph's chosen night. He had travelled down to Devon by train, somehow, possibly via Tavistock, possibly via Plymouth. The contemporary press accounts disagree on the route, and made his way up onto the moor, to the village of Princetown that existed because of the prison and for no other reason. On him, when he was searched a few hours later, were 2 items: a knife and a box of matches. Earlier in the evening, he had killed a sheep in a field outside the prison perimeter, carved a piece of meat out of its shoulder and eaten part of it raw. I can only assume that a fire would have given him away. So that's why the meat went down raw. He got over the perimeter wall somehow. The secondary accounts say through the deputy governor's garden, but the contemporary press just say he got over the wall. As he dropped down on the inside, his foot caught on a wire that ran along the inside of the perimeter, hooked up to an alarm bell at the main gate. The wire was a standard Victorian prison security feature. Its purpose was to catch men trying to break out. Nobody at the Home Office had really imagined the other use case. Captain Oswald Every, the governor of Dartmoor, had walked into the prison for his last inspection of the night just as the bell went off. A search party went out and they found Joseph hiding in the carpenter's shop, one of the work buildings inside the prison precinct. He was handcuffed and taken down to Princetown to the local police lockup. And at some point in the early hours of Sunday morning, he stopped pretending he had been there by accident. He told the constable he had broken in to murder Augustus Hardy and to set fire to the prison. And the fire was not just for the murder. He wanted the convicts inside to be liberated, and he named one of them, a man called Dixon, and another serving life. When the prison chaplain came down to see him later that morning, he told the chaplain the same thing. On the Tuesday, the 19th of August 1890, he was brought before the Tavistock magistrates. They had to put 2 warders in the dock with him because Augustus was sitting in the courtroom, and Joseph reportedly stared at him the entire time. When he was given a chance to speak, he spoke at length. He said he would have no peace of mind until Augustus was in his grave. He said he would mount the gallows with a contented mind if he could dispatch him before he went. He told the magistrate he had crossed the sea to do this. And then, having said all of that, he told the magistrate his real name was actually George Adolphus Gordon. The magistrate, doing the only sensible thing available to him, committed him for trial. The trial came on at the Devon Assizes in Exeter on the 29th of November 1890. Joseph denied his previous convictions, claiming he had been mistaken for a brother, which the jury did not buy. Augustus was called to give evidence, and his account in court was that his role at Dartmoor had only been to log reports, that he had nothing to do with adjudications or punishments, and that the practice of handcuffing prisoners who refused to work and leaving them in the cold applied to all of them, not just to Joseph. When Joseph addressed the court, he broke down in tears, admitting he had held a grudge, but pleading he had been in a passion at the time, and asking for mercy as a black man far from home. He was sentenced to 12 months hard labour. 12 months for a man who had crossed an ocean to commit a murder is, by the standards of Victorian sentencing, on the lighter end of what you might have expected. The reason becomes clear in what happened next. On the 23rd of March 1891, he was transferred from prison to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum at Crowthorne in Berkshire, which had opened in 1863 as the first institution of its kind in England, set among the pine woods of Windsor Forest, and was run from London by a council of supervision answerable to the Home Secretary. Broadmoor in the 1890s held two distinct classes of patient. The first were what they called Queen's Pleasure patients, people who had been acquitted of crimes on grounds of insanity and were being held indefinitely at the Crown's discretion. The second were insane convicts, men and women who had developed mental illness while serving prison sentences and had been transferred from prison to asylum to serve out the rest of their time. Joseph was the second sort. The censors caught him there a fortnight later. Infirmity, lunatic. That was the formal medical category of the day, and it was what got him out of the prison system and into the asylum system. He was discharged from Broadmoor on the 28th of August 1891 as recovered, which, in the medical language of the day, meant he was no longer judged a danger to himself or others, and he was put out on a ticket of leave. He ended up in Southampton under police supervision, with reporting obligations to the local force. What happens next in Southampton is genuinely interesting. In late November 1891, the local Southampton papers ran a piece specifically defending the local police, who they said had been trying to help Joseph reform. He had walked into the police station, asked for their help, and the chief constable had personally been trying to find him work. The piece was an editorial rebuttal aimed at the popular complaint that ticket of leave men were being deliberately frustrated by police surveillance. Proof, the paper said, that in Southampton at least, the police were on the side of the released convict. 1 week later, on the 3rd of December 1891, Joseph was at the Southampton Sailors' Home, one of the charitable institutions established in major British ports in the 1860s to provide cheap, supervised lodging to merchant seamen between voyages, when he stole a coat worth 18 shillings belonging to a porter called William. He hid it under some bedclothes and then took it with him to the Seamen's Institute, where the police caught up with him. Back at the station, the inspector greeted him with, "What, you come to see me again?" The court reportedly laughed. So much for the rebuttal. He was committed for trial, and it was at the police court committal on the Friday, the 4th of December, that he gave the speech. For an hour and a quarter, in front of a packed Southampton courtroom, Joseph spoke about the horrors of penal servitude. He told them about the 15 years. He spoke about what Dartmoor had been, about being treated worse than a dog, about Augustus. He said he would not be taken alive into prison again, and that a grave would be better for him now than another sentence. The courtroom reportedly was held silent the whole way through. The magistrates committed him for trial at the Hampshire Assizes, and when he realised what was happening, he had to be persuaded back to the cells, with the police keeping a close watch on him for fear he would try to take his own life. When the time came to remove him to Winchester Prison, he refused to be handcuffed, and there was a struggle before the cuffs went on. At the Hampshire Assizes on the 8th of December 1891, he was found guilty of stealing the coat and given 9 months imprisonment, along with 5 years police supervision. 5 years of having to report in, every move accounted for, in a country where he had no home, no work, and a record that would surface within minutes of any background check. He comes up next in October 1895 in Bishop Auckland in County Durham, working as a paid black actor in a touring Uncle Tom's Cabin theatrical company. Uncle Tom's Cabin shows had been touring British towns since the 1850s, dramatising Harriet Beecher Stowe's anti-slavery novel for provincial audiences, and they generally needed at least one black performer to take the title role or one of the supporting parts. Joseph fitted the bill. Whether the company knew that the man they were paying 12 shillings a week to play a fictional enslaved black character had himself spent 18 years inside the British convict system is not recorded. He was lodging in a house in Bishop Auckland and was charged with stealing a list of items from various rooms in it. A fur tippet, 2 silk handkerchiefs, a woolen shirt, a pair of linings, a muffler, gloves, cuffs, a hairbrush, a hat brush, and a pocket knife. Total value, about £2 5 shillings. He told the magistrates his motive had been to give the theatrical company a good show-up. Revenge, in other words, for the wages. He was using the name Joseph Hedderley Denny again, the name from his 1873 Liverpool conviction, which was the name now permanently attached to him in the habitual criminals register at Scotland Yard, meaning that the moment the local police ran his name, they were going to find everything. He was tried at the Durham Assizes on the 22nd of November 1895 in front of Justice William Grantham. William is worth a small detour. He was a former Conservative MP for East Surrey and then Croydon, knighted on his appointment to the Queen's Bench in 1886, and known throughout the legal profession for what one contemporary called an inability to refrain from perpetual comment. He was, in the assessment of the Dictionary of National Biography, not really suited to the higher courts, but perfectly competent at criminal cases on the assize circuit, which is exactly the kind of work he was doing the day Joseph stood in front of him. The previous convictions were laid out in court, every alias going back to Henry Dennis at London Petty Sessions in 1872. By the time the prosecutor finished reading them out, the man in the dock had appeared before British courts under at least 7 different names over 23 years. William sent him down for 36 months hard labour. And that is more or less where the trail goes cold. There is one later newspaper clipping from May 1896 describing a black man called Joseph Denny in court somewhere, bowing elaborately into the dock, dressed up in spectacles and rings and the blue ribbon of the temperance movement. The case dismissed because the prosecutor did not turn up. He was told to go back to Southampton and leave the country. Whether the man in that clipping was the same Joseph who had broken into Dartmoor is, at this point, not entirely clear, because if it was him, he should still have been 6 months into a 36-month hard labour sentence at Durham Jail. The dates don't quite line up, and we don't know how he came to be out. He was 50 years old by his own age in the records, and he had spent more than half his life inside the British penal system. Several accounts since have suggested he died in prison. No one has been able to find the record of it, and Joseph simply walks off the page. So, we know where Joseph started. Born in Barbados around 1846, gone to sea at 12, and in front of a London magistrate by 26. We know what he did on the night of the 16th of August 1890. We know what he said in court in 1881, and what he said in court in 1890 about his disgusting treatment at Dartmoor. What we don't know is where he went after 1896. Did he get back to sea? Did he make it home to Barbados? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoy videos like this, you're more than welcome to subscribe and join me for the next one. Thank you for watching.